Good evening, my friends. I'm Mark Evanier. Welcome to another one of my weekly webcasts where I talk to somebody I know who I think is interesting, and I want to talk to him for 90 minutes, and I'm going to let you listen in. In the late 60s, I was trying to figure out a route into the television business as a writer, and I occasionally would poach on the sets of various TV shows. I became pretty adept at getting into studios, getting onto sound stages. Today, to get onto like the NBC lot or the CBS or whatever, requires the exact same amount of effort that Goldfinger took to break into Fort Knox. But he's chuckling in the background. Thank you. And but back then, if you looked like you knew where you were going, you could just kind of walk in with a copy of Variety under your arm and wave to the guards and let you go. One of the places I visited memorably for myself was the set of The Odd Couple over at Paramount. And I would go over there. I think I may have gone twice, maybe three times. And I would watch Tony Randall and Jack Klugman rehearse The Odd Couple. And it was fascinating because these were two very serious actors who took their roles seriously. And you'd see them rehearsing, but you'd also see them stop and talk about almost every line. Would Felix say this? Well, what is Oscar thinking here? Very smart, perceptive process that they would use. Some actors don't do that. They worked well together that way. And one time when I was there, I watched them, and nobody stopped me. Nobody asked who I was, what I was doing in the bleachers watching that rehearsal. And I actually got to talk to like the stage manager, someone official who actually belonged there. And I asked him for a copy of the script that they were working, because they had a pile of them there. And he gave me a he gave me a copy of the script, which I took home to study. And it was written by a man named Ron Friedman. And I looked at that name, and I'd seen it on other shows before. But from that day forward, I was more conscious of seeing Ron's names in credits, and I saw it everywhere, and I was stunned by how many places I saw it, to the point where I think I may have wondered if there were two Ron Friedmans working in the business. And we didn't have an Internet Movie Database. There was no way to look him up, but eventually I was kind of staggered by the credits of this man. And I'm going to read a list in a minute of them. But first, let me introduce you to my friend, Mr. Ron Friedman. Thank you, Ron, for joining me tonight here. I'm going to read a list of your credits that came off the Internet Movie Database, and then I'm going to ask you to name some things that you wrote that are not on this. We're only talking about episodes of shows. We're not talking about TV movies or specials. We're just talking about episodes. My Favorite Martian, Get Smart, Bewitched, Gilligan's Island, The Andy Griffith Show, Love on a Rooftop, The Second 100 Years, I Dream of Jeannie, The Good Guys, The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, The Partridge Family, The Odd Couple, Funny Face, The Good Life, Getting Together, Me and the Chimp, The Super, Bridget Loves Bernie, Love American Style, Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, Dusty's Trail, Lots of Luck, All in the Family, That's My Mama, Chico and the Man, Barney Miller, Happy Days, Grady, Big John, Little John, Wonder Woman, All's Fair, Starsky and Hutch, The San Pedro Beach Bums, Charlie's Angels, Vegas, Fantasy Island, The Dukes of Hazzard, BJ and the Bear, Harper Valley PTA, Strike Force, Ace Crawford Private Eye, Small and Frye, The Fall Guy, G.I. Joe, Lime Street, American Playhouse, Bionic 6, Sledgehammer, Zorro, the new WKRP in Cincinnati, the Fantastic Four cartoon show, Iron Man, and Legend. And what's amazing not only is the volume there, but you have there situation comedies, you have variety shows, you have adventure shows. Generally speaking, a lot of guys did one and not the other two, and the three. Cartoon shows are in there too. Okay, what's not on there? Name some things that aren't on that list.
There was what I loved, which is a half-hour animated special for CBS called The Romance of Betty Boop.
Oh, I remember that. Okay, a Lee Mendelsohn production.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And in it, trying to remember what the organization was, Hearst. Hearst came to me and said, we want to do a Betty Boop special. And I said, who is Betty Boop? And they said, we have no idea. She was a porn star in animation before she was a character. Everybody thinks they know her, but they don't know who she is. And they said, we want it to be a musical. So I said, how about a depression musical in which Betty is a striver and an Iceman is in love with her? So I worked it out. I pitched it with Lee and Bill Melendez, who were really good friends, to CBS, and they approved it. And I had a great time doing it. And one of the hit songs was, "Are the stars out tonight? I don't care if I don't know if it's cloudy or bright, 'cause I only have ice for you, Betty." If my voice doesn't clear up, I'm canceling my bar mitzvah this Saturday.
All right. What else? Anything else? Any series missing from that?
Well, I did a 2-hour PBS movie called Two Daddies to Love Me, which was interesting. And Henry Winkler and Jerry Bruckheimer's wife, Linda Balahudas, produced it. So that was an unusual circumstance. I'm sure there were others, but I was so dazzled hearing what I had done to make a living that my mind just left me.
Now, you were working at a time which is not like these days, when if a TV series got an episode for 26 half hours, most of them would go to freelance writers, and the story editors might write a few of them and rewrite whatever was necessary of the freelancers' work. That is not the situation in most shows these days.
Right.
Most shows, instead of having 1 or 2 story editors, will have 18 people or 16 people or 12 people who are essentially staff writers, and they'll bat out the scripts together and take turns taking the credit. But you at that time were going from show to show to show, and you were transcending different genres.
Yeah.
Now, of the 4 genres I named, situation comedy, variety, the adventure type cop shows, and animation, leaving aside everything except having fun, what did you enjoy most? Which of the 4? Leaving aside money, leaving aside advancement and awards and publicity and things, just fun.
Okay, in terms of action adventure, I had a great time with Starsky and Hutch.
Okay, but I want you to pick which genre. Which genre?
Oh,
Situation comedy, variety, animation, or adventure shows?
well, the truth is, I love doing them all, and how happy I was depended on the people I was working with and for.
All right.
That was really it, because I always got a great kick out of doing my absolute best to make any job the best I could possibly make it. But when I was working with people that were fun, that were open, that weren't looking over their shoulders and pissed off because I was getting credit or I was called in to fix what they wrote, when I was working with people like that, and also when I was working with people like Aaron Spelling or Leonard Goldberg or who did Gilligan's Island, Sherwood Schwartz.
Sherman Schwartz, yeah.
Right. They loved me. They were thrilled when I came in. When I pitched something to Love American Style, all the story editors came in with the producers to hear my pitches. So it was really a pleasure. There were a lot of laughs. I had that in just about every genre. But I had, I'd say, the most clean-cut fun doing animation, because I love art. I am an artist. I'm a sculptor. I always have painted. I still do.
You started out as an architect.
Yes. Oh, I forgot that.
Yeah.
Yes, I must be old.
What was the first cartoon you wrote?
I'm trying to remember now. I think it was The Romance of Betty Boop.
Really? Okay. And you wrote a lot of G.I. Joe and Transformers, and you wrote a Fantastic Four, and you wrote Iron Man, and a bunch of other shows. You did some other things for Lee. We met through Lee Mendelson, I believe.
We did, and I love Lee, and I know you did too.
Yes, Lee was a wonderful man, the best producer I ever worked for.
He's right up there. You're right.
Yeah, and name another good producer, some other good producers you worked for.
Okay, Aaron Spelling was great.
All right.
One of the things that makes a great producer is if they see something that's good, they don't have to fix it. They're glad it's good, and they're eager to have you do more work. That makes life easier. And to me, also, it's what a good producer does. A good producer knows what he, she, or they are looking for. And when they get it, you get a seated ovation and a nice check. When they don't know, or when they're compelled to try to make it even better. That was Norman Lear, who was a great friend. And I did a lot of nice work for Norman. He was tougher because he was looking for the best possible outcome, but he was never unreasonable and he was always generous. Who else? David Gerber, a crazy guy, but a funny guy. I met him when he was a salesman for 20th Century Fox, and I was doing The Ghost of Mrs. Muir, and I got 2 pilots from CBS, and he pitched them. He took them around. My God, I can't wish for a better salesman for anybody. He talked so fast that he didn't remember what he said. It was fascinating, but a great guy. And Lenny Goldberg was very good to me, and there were a few others. Many were difficult because many of them literally did not know what they were doing.
Well, Ron, let me just take this. I want you to think of, and don't say his name, think of the worst producer you ever worked for, just for a minute.
I'm going through alphabetically.
Okay, or just pick a one you would never have gone back to. When you finished that assignment for him, you said, "I'm never going to answer that man's calls again." All right, tell me why that person was so bad.
This person was constitutionally unable to accept any effort but his own. So he always directed the director. He always rewrote from page 1 every script. He put his name on every script that anybody put in there. And he was so nuts and such a control freak that he actually physically moved onto the lot and was living there so he could rewrite, redirect, re-edit, everything anybody ever did.
I think I know who you're talking about.
I think you must.
Okay.
He was great at lunch.
Did his first name start with a D?
Yes, absolutely.
Did his last name start with an A?
Started with Arnold.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never wanted to work with him, but I used to love to go to lunch with him and a bunch of the guys. Finally, he insisted I do Barney Miller. Other than having a hot water enema with jalapenos, there was nothing more punishing. And I said to him, "Danny, you're a great guy for lunch, but you're a fucking asshole doing that." And he laughed like hell. He said, "That's my way." So I saw guys that did this and worked with him closely, and they said, "Well, that's the man." I couldn't do it. I fought him. So I did the 2 Barney Millers, hating every minute. And then years later, he calls me and he says, "I have deals at every network." He said, "I can't possibly do them all." He said, "I would like you to do a pilot that is pre-sold for ABC. I'd like you to write it. I want you to do it with Sam Bobrick." I said, "Great. Sam's a friend of mine. He's a good writer." "Sure." Big fucking mistake. Here's what it was about. It was about urban homesteading. Urban homesteading was this, pioneered in New York City, that had a lot of derelict buildings. The deal was they would give the building to a group of people who were like-minded and show they had the credentials not to freak out on drugs and not to steal from the poor. And they would give them the property to rehab. When they finished rehabbing, they could buy it for a pittance, thereby upgrading and even gentrifying whole neighborhoods. Well, I was an architect for 11 years. I knew all about that. I knew about construction. I knew about pricing. I knew about what it takes and what it needs. And the kicker for me was that the city paid for instructors to teach these people to be carpenters and plumbers and electricians. So they came out of it with a trade, and they had a great home for bupkis. So I knew what I was getting into. I filled Sam in. Danny paid for first-class air trip. He had a limo waiting for us, driven by a criminal with guns. And the first stop was a hotel, which was first rate. And in the morning, we were supposed to meet with people in the afternoon. And I said in the morning, "Sam, we're going over to the City of New York Building Department to find out what's going on. So I got in there because I said, I'm an architect from Pittsburgh. I'm here because of urban home. Oh, yeah, sure. So we talked to the people. I got all of the inside dope. I heard stories about a pimp that sent his hookers in to remodel the property. And when it was done, he set them up in a little whorehouse that they paid New York about $5 for. So I heard all of this great stuff. And then the afternoon, we went to see some of these in progress situations, and we saw one that was finished. Fascinating. A lot of the people were fascinating. One of them was a track inspector for the subway, and his wife was a nurse. There was no way they were going to get a home that wasn't in a who shot who neighborhood. But they had this beautiful place. It cost them nothing. They were able to send their kids to call. I mean, it was just wonderful. So the day after, Danny says, come in for lunch and we'll talk. So we went in for lunch, and I started to say to him, he said, no, here's the story. I said, but you sent us to New York. We know things you don't know. He said, no, here's the story. That was the beginning of a fucking nightmare. So if Danny comes back, do not work for him. I don't care what he's going to pay you. Forget it. But
When I was
a great guy for lunch.
When my partner Dennis and I were doing Welcome Back, Kotter, we taped on the ABC lot Tuesday nights. Barney Miller taped on the ABC lot Tuesday nights.
Oh yeah.
And we would finish the final taping with the audience at around 9:30. We would have an hour of pickups. We would have a meeting, and we'd be out of there at midnight. And on our way out, we would pass the stage where Barney Miller was, and sitting outside in the little picnic type area, lunch area, were Hal Linden and Steve Landisberg and the whole cast waiting for Danny to rewrite the script. They had taped all day, and Danny had thrown it all out and was rewriting. And we would come in the next day for the read through of our next script. And the question that would then be, we'd ask somebody who worked there, what time did Barney Miller rap last night? And they would say 4 a.m. He kept the cast there till 4 a.m. while he rewrote dialogue, and they learned it and such. And the show came out pretty good is the punchline of that, I think. But
it usually did, but it was at an enormous human cost.
Yeah.
I look at it this way. If Danny had known Betsy Ross, there would be no flag. There would be like a doily with a hole in it.
We have people watching us in the chat room. One of them is a friend of mine named Scott Edelman, who I worked with in the comic book business a bit. And Scott wrote here, if he wrote Big John, Little John, he wrote words for my cousin Herb Edelman. And you also worked on The Good Guys with Herb Edelman, and probably something else because Herb was in so many shows over the years.
Herb was great. And in fact, when I had a backers audition reading of my play, which was called A Place in the Land, Herb was the star, along with Dick Gautier, Chuck McCann, and a bunch of other great actors, including a West End British actor, James Warwick. And they tore the roof off the Santa Monica Playhouse twice. And the three backers we had ready to fund it, two of them died immediately. And the third one was carried away by the dragons from Game of Thrones. But I'll tell you what the plot was. It's two old Jews have bought land for a cemetery for their aging congregation. And they're going over the contract with Goldfarb, one of the old Jews' son. And he says, they changed the zoning. This can't be a cemetery unless you find a body and bury it before Tuesday. Because they changed the zoning because they can get a better deal from a shopping center. And the father says to Glick, his friend, we need a stiff. So the whole play is them trying to find a body to bury. And it was really hysterical.
Now, Herb was one of the old Jews. Who's the other one?
Howard Morris. I forgot.
Oh, Howie. Yes, okay. That's like this is like the cast of one of my shows. We had Dick Gautier and Howie Morris and Chuck McCann on Garfield, a few lots. Also, my friend Scott writes to me, and I had such a crush on Judy Carn in Love on a Rooftop, I might have been speechless in her presence. Scott, that's the reason I used to poach on the Laugh-In set, Judy Carn. I felt the same way. But I imagine you weren't on the set for a lot of these, were you, Ron?
Yes.
You were or weren't?
I often was, and I was at every taping, every dress, and every final taping. Yeah. And on The Odd Couple, I enjoyed it particularly because Jack and Tony became friends. And I don't know if I ever told you the Jack Klugman story, because he came from...
You will now.
Okay, I will. I will. Don't stop me because I'm on a roll. All right. Jack went to the same school I went to, Carnegie Tech, now Carnegie Mellon. I was in the Department of Architecture, but always taking additional courses in the drama department. That's why I learned to become a scene designer. That's why I took acting courses, scene design, costume design, makeup. I could do all that stuff. Lighting was great. But also, when I met Jack, I said, "You went to Carnegie Tech?" He says, "Yes." I said, "How did that happen? Who did you read for?" He said, "I read for Henry Betcher." Henry Betcher was the head of the department, a great, wonderful guy, really terrific. And he made Noel Coward look butch. So I said, "How did you come to be there?" And he said, "I was a waiter at Bookbinders in Philadelphia. I was into the Shylocks for 5 large because he was a big gambler on the horses." He says, "I'm coming to work and this monster grabs me and he says, 'Klugman, coming by Saturday and you're going to pay up plus the vigorish. I'm going to break off your legs and shove them up your ass one at a time.'" And Jack said, "That didn't sound like a plan for the future. So I decided I'll become an actor." And I said, "So you read for Henry Betcher. What did he say?" He said, "You're not an actor, you're a truck driver. But there's a war on and we need men. You're in."
Well, he was a pretty good actor for a truck driver.
He was great. And Tony, my ticket to Tony was my mother was an opera singer.
Oh, yes, yes.
I grew up listening to opera. I knew the scores. I knew I knew them. I knew everything. So Tony grabs me one day and he says, "Everyone here is a Philistine. I want to do an Odd Couple with an opera bass." He said, "You're the only one I can turn to. Do it." And he said,
"Okay, hold on. It was called Does Your Mother Know You're Out, Rigoletto?"
That was it.
And that was the script that I was watching them rehearse.
How about that?
That was the one. I've got this. I think I still have the script in my storage unit someplace.
I know I do, because I was very happy with it. And anyway, the idea was that Felix had an opera group and an amateur opera group, and that his star, the Rigoletto star, hurt himself in a softball game with Oscar's group in Central Park. So he's in a cast and he can't do it. So Felix finds another opera singer, Richard Fredericks of the New York City Opera, to come in, and he sings Rigoletto while Oscar, Jack, plays Rigoletto on stage in the jester's humpback costume. I loved it. It got a lot of attention. I had a great time.
Okay. One of our people in the chat room is named TF Cannon Fodder, and the TF stands for Transformers, pointing out Dick Gaudier and Chuck McCann loved them as actors. They were both in G.I. Joe and Transformers.
Right.
And we're going to talk about Transformers later, because I think once we get on the subject of the Transformers, we'll never get off it. Now, you worked on, I'm going to talk about a few of the shows you worked on. I was fascinated by the Danny Kaye show.
Me too.
And if you remember when the Paley Center had an evening about the Danny Kaye show, I took you as my date. We had like good comedy writers. We had dinner at Nate and Al's Delicatessen, and then we went to the Paley Center and had a good time there. And you are the only person I've ever met who worked on the Danny Kaye show who liked Danny Kaye.
I liked him because he liked me, which was really shocking.
Okay.
But
because
go ahead.
No, I'm just saying Mr. Gelbart worked on the show. He was not happy with him. Mr.
Nope.
Tolkien worked on the show. He was not happy with him. Howie Morris was on the show a number of times. He hated him.
Exactly.
Did not get along with him. And Danny Kaye was always one of those people I thought was magical. And I was kind of shocked that not everybody loved him. But, you know,
I feel the same and I understand.
did you like writing in the environment of variety shows?
Well,
Writing sketches, writing in a room with other writers a lot, pitching stuff back and forth, or are you the kind of guy who'd rather just go home and write by yourself?
I would prefer to go home and write by myself because it's faster and I don't have to be polite when somebody's pitching stuff that I really think didn't work and wasn't worth the effort. But I enjoy working with other people, particularly when they're talented. And also particularly when they weren't so competitive that it was really a blood feud every time there was a disagreement. And one of the things I always felt is if I get stuck on a joke, move on, you can come back. If something isn't working, move on, keep going, feed yourself, inspire yourself, just get on with it, get something down, and then look at it. Say, where could I have done better? Why don't I try this instead of that? But in a writer's room, you have to have some leeway, some allowance to do that. Danny Kaye show, first year there, Shelley Keller was the head writer, and he typed. So we worked out what we were going to do, and then he would rewrite everything with the group as he typed. So it was, to me, wasteful, but it was fun in a lot of ways because Paul Mazursky was there and Larry Tucker and Mel Tolkien, whom I liked. When I first met him and he was negative about my work, I leaped across the table and grabbed him by the shirt. And I said, if you're going to fuck me, do it in the hall, not in front of these Jews. So everything was all right after that. But Perry Lafferty, who came to send me to California after he and Danny saw an act I wrote for Vaughn Meter at the Blue Angel after Kennedy had been shot. And Vaughn Meter says, well, what the fuck am I going to do now? I said, you'll come back in 6 months with a new act. Everybody will be there. Anyway, Danny and Perry saw the show, which got the same review everywhere, and everybody covered it. The material was brilliant, but Vaughn Meter is an indifferent but nice performer. So that wasn't good for Vaughn. It was good for me. They saw me, and they said, you're coming to California. I said, I hate California. Perry says, you're coming. Anyway, I get there. I might as well tell you this because I hated California. I'd been there in 1953 for the summer after I'd been at Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin West. I'd been invited there, found out I was in a cult of maniacs, left, went to Los Angeles to write for an architect. I hated it. Los Angeles in 1953, the smart woman's shop in Beverly Hills was Walter Clark that sold Hawaiian muumuus. There was no sidewalk cafe. The only sidewalk cafe was sealed in a room. The restaurant opened past 10. There was only one, was Ollie Hammond's on La Cienega Boulevard.
I used to love Ollie Hammond's.
I did too.
Yeah, it was a great place.
And you went everywhere by streetcar for 10 cents. But I hated it because it was like Pittsburgh in 1939, and I had enough of that. Anyway, I told Perry when he was quizzing me about my 5 weeks with Frank Lloyd Wright. He thought that was fascinating. So I'm sitting in the room, and Danny's there, and I'm there because he wanted me there. And Perry said, Ron was with Frank Lloyd Wright, Danny. And he says, yes, tell us about it. So this whole room of guys I really don't know. And I told him about it, which went like this. Wesley Peters, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's chief draftsman, came to architectural school in Pittsburgh. I don't know why. After I had won an award from Bloomcraft Stairs, designing a stairway using Bloomcraft machine parts. So he looked at it and he said, I think the master might be interested. And I said, Jesus is interested? And he said, no, Frank Lloyd Wright, can you come to Taliesin this summer until mid-June when we move to Taliesin East in Spring Green, Wisconsin? I said, yeah, absolutely. Are you kidding? So I arranged to take my test early, went out there, and I was met on the hottest day in Arizona. Gila monsters are vomiting. And I met by a guy in Renaissance garb with pantaloons and buckled shoes and heavy brocade and a cap with a feather in it. And he says to me, "Are you Friedman?" And I said, "I'm not sure. It was a tough ride." And he says, "Come with me." And he takes me to a burnt orange Studebaker. He said, "This is the only car the master approves of." And then he drives me out to Taliesin West, where I hear sort of Renaissance music. And I get there, and in the midst of this complex, which was boiling in the sun, everybody's sitting in Renaissance garb, and there's a Renaissance trio on the center stage playing Boccherini. And I'm looking on it and I'm saying, I've entered a nut house. Well, what the hell is this? And he says to me, "You're very late. So the building materials that are available are quite limited." I said, "What does that mean?" He says, "Well, you're required to build your own habitat." I said, "You're kidding me. I just was on the bus for 7 hours and I have to build my habitat." He said, "Everybody did." He said, "But all we have left is this. It's a 55-gallon oil drum, empty, and this. It's a wooden piano case." And I said, "Bullshit. I'm not going to make that. I'm not." He said, "Well, then you'll have to sleep in the drafting room." I said, "Well, then I'll sleep in the drafting room." So I was exhausted. I was hot. I went into the drafting room. In all of the literature, and if you look up Taliesin West, it will show you the drafting room, which has a very blindingly white canvas sloped roof, ceiling, and rocks everywhere. And the legend was, because the structure has been so cleverly oriented on the site, the prevailing breezes will always cool it, and the reflective surface of the roof will deflect the heat of the day. It was 185 in there. Flies were dying. It was unbelievably hot. And I figured, I'm in the land of nuts. I fell asleep on the floor. I get up in the morning because I smell bread baking. So I come out. Here's everybody now, not in Renaissance costume. And they're setting up tables around the same amphitheater that was where the music was being played. And the tables are set with rolls, with coffee, or whatever the hell it was. I immediately went for a roll. And somebody slapped my hand and he says, "Nothing until the master has spoken." I am not happy. And then I hear, it's Frank Lloyd Wright with his long scarf and his homespun jacket and his crazy hat. And he's coming in with his giant Croatian wife, Evanier, whom I later met her brother, who was a waiter in an Italian restaurant in Los Angeles. His name was Augie, I forget his name, Augians. And he ended up being a professor of math at Cal State. Anyway, here comes the master, who was very old, along with old Evanier, who was about 6'1", and he's about 4'8". And everybody's silent. She comes in, she sits down, he stands up, everybody stands up. He sits down, everybody sits down, then he stands up. And he's holding a snail shell. And he says, "The snail, a magnificent architect. His home, a volute. No front door with 3 little windows, so the 3 little bears can peek in." And I'm thinking, gee, this is great. And I see everybody around me, they're mouthing it. He's done it 100 times. He's gaga, and he's doing it again. Anyway, next step, I was looking for my assignment, expecting to be drafting in the drawing room or something. And instead, I'm assigned to the carrot patch. They did some hyperponic gardening, which was putting trays of dirt on sawhorses under some cheesecloth. I was assigned to the square rectangle of dirt, which was carrots. And there were several of these in line. And I'm standing there thinking, this is what I left school so fast for? This is what I'm doing in this blazing heat? with these maniacs. And then I see Wright, and he's approaching with the scarf in the wind and the hat and the homespun jacket, and he's got a cane. And I see him coming, and I think I better do something to show I'm here for purpose. So I started weeding the carrots, and I'm doing it, and I smile up to him, and he hits me on the neck with the cane. He says, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm weeding the carrots, Mr. Wright." He says, "Bullshit, you're picking the carrots." And I looked, there were little orange carrots there. I said, "I'm sorry, there's not much agriculture in Pittsburgh." He says, "Nothing, nothing." And I'm standing there thinking, why am I here? And then he picks up some dirt from the box, throws it in the air, and the wind blows it in my eyes. And he says, "An architect must know which way the wind doth blow." Then he walks past me to the next space, which is a Japanese kid named Hiro, and he does the same thing to him. And now there's a procession of blinded people. Anyway, Wesley Peters came to me and he says, "We're going to be moving to Spring Green and we'd like you to come. How does $300 sound?" I said, "What, a week, a month?" He said, "A month." I said, "I can't live on that and I'm still in school." He said, No, you pay us." That's when I left. So I told that to the writer's room, and Danny loved to see their startled expressions. He loved that. I helped him throw a curve. So thereafter, Danny would always check with me. He treated me great. Everybody else he treated like shit. Harvey Korman said when asked about Danny Kaye, he said he did a great impression of a human being. And I guess that was true. But anyway, when you took me to the what is it? Not the Getty?
The Paley Center.
Paley Center. His daughter, Dina, was there. And I'd met her when she was a little girl. And I remembered the song he did on his album, which was "Dina, Is There Anyone Fina in the State of Carolina." I loved that album. And I spoke to her and I said how much I liked Danny and he liked me. She looked at me like I was nuts.
The story that Howie Morris used to always tell, he's on an episode with Vincent Price, was a guest star. And Vincent takes him to one side. He says, "Howie, I got to ask you a question in private." And he gets to where nobody can hear him, and he says, "Howie, is Danny Kaye an asshole?" And Howie says, "Yes." And Vincent said, "Oh, thank God, I thought it was me."
Well, Vincent was a friend of mine.
Yeah. Well, you worked with everybody. That's one of the reasons I wanted you on here. You worked with everybody over the years.
I really did.
Did you ever not get along with someone?
I'm trying to remember. It happened so seldom. I was very lucky. And I used to think, what's his problem? You know, and I said to some of these people, "You don't know me well enough to shit on me. Give me a chance to piss you off."
Now tell me, let's talk about a fellow who everybody watching this probably heard of, and everybody who encountered him has stories. Pat McCormick.
Oh God, yes. Pat was my off and on writing partner for many years. We each continued doing our own writing assignments, but in the years we worked together, we had an amazing, wild, hilarious, and sometimes dangerous time. Because Pat was a guy who could embarrass a toilet seat in Manila during a beer drinking contest. Excuse me. One of Pat's favorite moves was if you were walking with him and a pretty girl went by, he'd say, "Blow me." And as she looked, he'd shove me and say, "How dare you offend this young woman? I'm sorry, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's just terrible." And he shoved me again. Once I got my face slapped because he yelled, "Blow me." This was the guy. He was so embarrassing that when we went to London, because we'd written Lucy in London, a special with Tony Newley and a lot of great people and a great director, Steve, trying to remember his name now, great director, Steve Binder. And it should have been a lot of fun. And it was, except that Pat was doing this blow me shit. And we were in the Cheshire Cheese, which was one of the places to go. And it was a convocation of university professors. And I don't want to go in there with them because I know he'll embarrass me. And he says, "Don't worry, I know how to behave. I'm a Harvard man." And he was, and a track star. Anyway, we go in there And here are all these refectory tables, different nationalities, different colors, and they're discussing erudite topics. And Pat and I are seated, but before Pat sits down, he turns his ass to the group and farts so loudly it rattled the pewter plates. And then he sits down and he shoves me. He says, "How dare you embarrass me in front of this august crowd?"
The memorial service for Pat was quite one of the funniest evenings I've ever spent in my life. I don't know if you know this, but I was in charge of the seating arrangements at that event, and I had spoken at that in that room from that podium a few months earlier for the memorial for Lorenzo Music, and I got up there, and I don't always feel comfortable speaking in front of people who should be on stage when I should be in the audience, and I had to look because he was sitting right in front of the stage. I had to look right into the face of Bob Newhart the whole time I was up there, and that was very intimidating for me. You might not be intimidated, but I was. So when it came time for Pat's memorial, and I was seating all the guests, I looked at that seat, the one that Bob Newhart had been in. It's right in front of the podium, and I thought, I'm going to, for my own private fun, I'm going to put in that seat the person I think will most intimidate the speakers at the podium. You remember who you were looking at when you were up there talking? Who was in the front row in that seat?
George Carlin.
Right, George Carlin. I thought
Berman.
Shelley Berman was next to him, and we had Jonathan Winters there, and you gave a very wonderful speech, but it was not the only wonderful one. Everybody was pretty good that night.
Great,
Jack Riley was amazing, and
I had to follow George Carlin.
That's right, you did. That's right.
When I came off to heavy mitting, George says, "Why aren't you fucking doing this for a living?" He says, "You can open for me anytime." I said, "No, George, I don't want that life. It's the dance or nothing." But I knew George before. He was a great guy, always. But I was determined not to be intimidated, but it wasn't easy looking at that murderer's row.
Yeah. Do you remember what George Carlin said was to his ear the funniest exit line he'd ever heard from someone? For Pat McCormick said the funniest line he ever heard a comedy writer say as he left a room. And everybody is sitting there waiting to hear what this line is. And the line was, "I'm sorry, I have to go get a hand job from Harry Von Zell." and the room exploded. It was anyway. Everybody did well up there except Marty Ingalls.
Black cloud.
Yeah. Did you find? I mean, Pat was rare in that he was a comedy writer, funnier than most of the people who performed his comedy. A lot of comedy writers, very quiet, very subdued, maybe not very good at pitching in the room. And Neil Simon was notoriously bad at getting heard in a room that also included Mel Brooks. Did you find yourself intimidated in those situations?
No, I don't know what it was, but I knew I had to be a writer. And when I found the courage to sell my architectural practice for $11 and move to New York with no guarantees, I figured I'm in for everything. And I was basically a shy guy. As an architect, I'd had to come up and be not shy when I was firing contractors and dealing with murderers. But I decided I'm not going to be intimidated. I'm going to let it fly. And I got a lot of work by sitting in the lobby at the William Morris office and accosting people. As they came off the elevator, I'm in their face doing 5 minutes. I got a lot of work.
Who were, now, aside from Von Meter, who were some guys you wrote stand-up stuff for?
I have to think now. Well, Jonathan Winters, I was his head writer for almost 5 years, and his head writer and co-producer on the Jonathan Winters show. He was great. We hit it off instantly. I wrote for Phyllis Diller. I have to think hard because I wrote for Henny Youngman, who you know was a good friend. I wrote for God.
God, you wrote for God? He was big for a while there.
Yeah, but he wasn't good when he was alone on stage. He needed a xylophone or he the way Joey Bishop began touring as a comic with a guy who played the xylophone. That was Rummy Bishop, who then sold his xylophone and just was like his stooge. So it was Joey Bishop and Rummy Bishop. And I remember seeing them there. That's why when I met Don, I said, "Where's Rummy?" And he says, "How the fuck do you know that?" Anyway, I wrote for Don.
Okay.
Victor Borga, I wrote a lot for Victor Borga, who was great. We became kind of friends. And he used to call me from anywhere in the world at any time. And he'd say, "I'm in Guam. Give me some Guam jokes." And he called me once from Iowa. I don't know what the fuck he was doing in Iowa. He says, "I'm in Iowa. Give me a joke." I said, "Are you flying in or taking the ox cart?" He said, "I'm flying in." I said, "When you say you rented your piano from Hertz, it was waiting for you on the runway." And he loved that.
Okay.
Anyway, I asked him how he learned to speak English because I knew he spoke French and German, Yiddish, and certainly Danish. And I said, "Did you speak English?" He says, "No." I said, "Well, when you were rescued, like most Danes were to escape Hitler, how did you learn English?" He says, "Well, first, I was given a free room and board at the Danish Seamen's Church, which provided rooms for Danish seamen when they were in New York." He said, "So it was very nice. The food was good." He said, "It was close to 42nd Street." He says, "Where you could see movies all day for 10 cents. He said, "So I went into the movies and I watched and listened and I learned English until a friend of mine said, 'Victor, you got to stop watching those movies.' And I said, 'Why?' He says, 'You sound like a gangster.'" He was doing George Raft.
Some of the people who are watching this are probably interested. I mentioned in my blog that you were one of the writers who tried to fix Minnie's Boys.
Oh, God. What an experience.
A very notorious show that closed.
Not soon enough.
Well, what are some of the other jobs like that you had? Can you think of some other cases where you came in to be a show doctor? And
yes, but I was not permitted to speak of it. I did that a lot in television. Where I'd get a call, "You got to fix this pilot. We're doing a special. It's not working. We'll give you a lot of money, but we can't give you credit because we've already given the credits. We don't have the budget." So I did a lot of that with non-disclosure. And a lot of the things did very well. And I like to think it was because I helped fix them. But let me talk about Minnie's Boys for a moment, because it was my first and last experience with Shelley Winters, which was a blessing. Anyway, the director of Minnie's Boys was a friend of mine, a director who'd made unbelievable millions in advertising, putting together his own advertising company that filmed the commercials for all the biggies. And he was a theater director, and he called me. He says, "I'm working on a mutt show." In other words, a dog of a show. He says, "I want you in here to see what you can do." He said, "The producer's afraid to open." He says, "We're still in tryouts in the Majestic Theater in New York," which was then the biggest theater in New York. He says, "You're going to come in, look at the show, and then we'll talk." So I come in. They put me up in a nice hotel. I go in before showtime, and he said, "I got you good seats." He says, "I'm not going to say anything. You'll make your own decision." So I'm sitting there in the good seats. In the front 2 rows, I was in the 3rd row, was a group called Young Talmud of Long Island. Young Talmud were all Hasidic Jews with fur hats, sideburns, and their wives were wearing wigs. And I'm thinking, what a theater group. Wonderful. Then I watched the show. Deadly. But something happened that I later had explained to me, which was this. Shelley Winters was a nervous eater. When the show began in tryouts, she weighed 115 pounds. By the time I got there, she weighed 150. And they had to rebuild costumes for her because in one of the scenes, she's Minnie Marks of the Marks boys who were her kids. She's dressed as a rabbit. They're dressed as bunnies. Her rabbit suit became gigantic. It looked like a fullback suit for the NFL. Huge. But the problem was when she spoke, her voice was loud and clear. When she sang, her voice was so she needed it mic'd, heavily mic'd. But when she moved around the stage, she farted. So that night she's moving and singing, and I'm hearing, and one of the people in front turns to her husband and she said, "Was ist das?" which is Yiddish for "what's that?" And he said, "Feedback." So he knows the audience.
Well, tell me some other odd jobs you had like that. If you there's things you must have some things you aren't under a non-disclosure agreement about.
Okay, well, I can't mention those, but it doesn't matter. You would recognize the shows. But it's like I gave my word and they paid me a lot.
Okay, but so tell me some that you can mention. There must be some things you can mention.
Well, I had a great deal with Norman Lear to come in 2 days a week and fix scripts that were in trouble. Got credit. And that was really unique. And doing that, I met one of his consultants, Ben Stein. Yes, the son of the Stein, who was the Republican money expert. And Ben, of course, was a little to the right of Genghis Khan, but I liked Ben and he liked me. And it was interesting to find that we had some common ground. He had sold Norman a pilot idea called Where the Money Is, which was about a bank, which to me, like any place else, if the characters are interesting and funny, you'll watch them clean chickens. But it never got off the ground. And I had a great time with Norman. I was originally brought in by Arnie Rosen, who was a terrific writer and a lovely guy, who at that time was dying of kidney disease.
Yeah, I was working with him on the Nancy Walker show.
Then I did Nancy Walker's. I forgot about that. And that's where I saw Arnie, and then he called me in again, and I saw him on a sort of collection of the Lear shows. Then All in the Family, I forget what it's called, with Bernadette Peters.
All's Fair.
All's Fair, and a pilot which was called A Day at the Top or something, which was
at the top.
That's it, starring Mickey.
No, a year at the top. It was a year at the top with Mickey Rooney.
Right.
Yeah.
And a girl who looked like Mama Cass.
And Paul Schaefer.
Yes.
Right. I remember that show.
It was about a wannabe rock show that sucked, and they were old, and they made a deal with the devil, so they're reborn as a great rock show. Anyway, a good premise, which they kept rewriting, and it kept getting worse and worse, and firing some of the rockers who went through scenes of torment. That was amazing. Anyway, I was in that, and Arnie was dying of dialysis, and he said, "I'm going to cut it off." He says, "I can't stand it." I said, "Arnie, you're doing good work. People love you." He says, "No." He said, "The time's going to come when I'm going to just have to cut it off." But he says, "Until I do," he said, "you're one of the few people I know that can deliver." He said, "So I want you here. You'll be of great help." And then he sent me to Norman, who Norman said, "You know, there aren't many of us who can do what you do." And I said, "I'm proud and happy to be considered in that number." So it was really a delightful experience until my then agent sent my Norman contracts to Aaron Spelling, for whom I was working constantly, each with a non-limiting contract. I was by the job with each of them, so I wasn't under contract to each of them. But when each saw the contract, what I'm making with Aaron, what I'm making with Norman, and they saw that, let's say it chilled the room. So I fired my agent, and it was really terrible. I'm telling this as a kind of didactic story for those of you who get into the business, which is there's no way to cover your ass. No way.
The Norman Lear offices were a very fun place. There were a lot of guys who had been around for some time there. Bill
Two
Josephsberg was there, and Gary Belkin. I met him. I'm surprised we didn't meet there because I was we may have passed in the halls and not known.
Yeah, and the two
Uh,
balls.
but then I was working with Jerry Davis there.
Oh, I love it, Jerry.
Yeah.
Love
Okay, now let's mention a few other shows you worked on. I got a lot of interest in the fact that you wrote for Gilligan's Island.
Oh yes.
One of your earlier credits there. What did you think of that show?
I wondered when I first saw it, who's going to watch? And then I watched, and I thought, this is kind of dumb, cute, and funny, and the characters are stereotypes that anybody who's watching with half an eyeball understands. The millionaire, Jim Backus, the movie star, and Mary Ann, and the professor, and the cat. I mean, it was like Commedia dell'arte. They might as well wear T-shirts and say who they were, the smart guy, the dumb guy. And Gilligan was the centerpiece around which all kind of shit happened that he was blamed for if it went wrong. And then I looked at the opening sequence, which is these quick cuts, and the lyrics of the song spell out exactly what the show is. So if you had a six-pack and you're sitting in front of the screen half blacked out, and this comes on, you know what you're watching. You immediately connect. Desert island, assholes marooned, one of the bigger assholes, like the collecting point for story. And I figured out this in its own way is brilliant. It's brilliant because it makes known what it's doing in an immediately accessible, kind of funny, charming way. And people always buy and go for what they think they know and like. True about everything. We always look, you want to watch that, you want to read that, you want to go to this. It's, hey, that sounds like something I like. So if you have an understanding beforehand, you're going to sign up. You're going to give it a shot. And I thought, that's smart. So then I decided to write one, and Sherwood fell in love with me on that script. And Sherwood was delightful. Anytime I came in, he said, all right, this won't take long. And I pitched something. He says, go write it. And that's the way it went. And it was great fun with Sherwood. Every show he had, he wanted me on. But Dusty's Trail, About Time. I forget what some of the others were, Big John, Little John. Always. So it was a great source of revenue. And the only one of his shows he wanted me to write and I didn't want to bother with was the Brady Bunch. Because to me, that was too soft. Anyway, it was great fun working with him. And trying to think, Gilligan, Bob Denver. I watched and loved many loves of Dobie Gillis, which was a big comedy hit in the 50s. I was a student and then an architect when I watched it. And of course, Bob Denver had one of the co-starring roles as a beatnik called Maynard G. Krebs, who always appeared on screen with bongos and was kind of like the stoned philosopher. And so I felt that I knew him. And we immediately bonded when I talked about Max Schulman, who created Dobie Gillis. So he was a lovely guy.
You and I were talking about Max Schulman before we went on the air here, on the web here. And I was telling you, I was working for Jimmy Comack. You were working for Jimmy Comack on Chico and the Man while I was working for Jimmy Comack on Cotter. Mm-hmm. And in the same unit where they were doing Cotter, they did this pilot for CBS, which was a Dobie Gillis reboot. It was Dobie Gillis 20 years later. And Max Schulman and Eric Cohen wrote the script. And I thought it was funny and brilliant. And Comack threw it out, claiming he had never seen the original show, and he thought that gave him the perspective of an audience, a TV audience, a watcher who had never seen the show. So in other words, you have to. He said, I want the show to be for people who've never seen the old show, so there's no point in doing Dobie Gillis. But I remember Dwayne Hickman and Bob Denver being furious that they've been baited and switched. They signed on to do one script, and now they were being handed another. And I had lunch with Mr. Denver in the ABC commissary one time, and all he did was just grit his teeth and just seethe over that thing. And Max Schulman is a great, one of the best comedy writers who ever lived. They were doing that to him, and I think that was one of the last things he did. Now, you told me something about Max Schulman I didn't know just a few minutes ago about him ghostwriting Play Doctoring.
Yeah, Play Doctoring, South Pacific, and Mr. Roberts.
And I never knew that he was associated with those. There were two great plays, very successful, and
they each came from a succession of short stories. So the through line was kind of vague, and the character relationships didn't quite emerge sharply enough, and Max fixed both of them.
That's fascinating. I didn't know him really. I met him, just he was in and out briefly.
You would have loved him. We would see him and his wife frequently. And the day before he died, I saw him on the Paramount lot. I was going in for a meeting on, I forget which show. And there's Max. And he looks horrible. And he grabs me and he said, "Oh, Ronnie, let's get shicker," which means let's get drunk. And I said, "I'd love to do that, Max, but I got to make a living." He says, "I'm going to wait for you. I'm going to wait for you." And I came back out. He hadn't waited because he was going home to go to the hospital to die of prostate cancer. Because he would always say, "I don't want a stranger up my ass." So he never had a prostate check. He avoided it, as a lot of men did to their peril. But I really loved Max. If you knew him, you'd have loved him. I just told Mark the story about Max and Rod Amato, who was his longtime producer and often director. Rod was about 5 feet tall, and Max was about 5 feet tall. Didn't matter because Max was 6'9" in his mind. And in fact, one of his sons, who was about 5'2", was a star on the basketball team of the University of Minnesota at 5'2". Anyway, Max and Rod are walking down the street at Paramount when an executive, one of the suits, comes out and he says, "Hey, 10 feet of talent." Max and Rod had him shot. Again, to me, one of the great Max stories. And if you get a chance, find and read Barefoot Boy with Cheek, which he wrote about his stay at the University of Minnesota, which began by him meeting the president, who he called Mr. Ingeborg, because it was full of Swedes and Norwegians and Danes. And he said, "Hello, Mr. Ingeborg." And Mr. Ingeborg spit at him and threw a lit cigarette at his feet. Anyway.
All right. Folks in the chat room, tell me the names of things that Ron worked on you'd like to have me ask him about. We got about another half hour here, and I want to talk about I can't pick among all the things the guy's done. So tell me the names of shows you want me to focus on, or other questions you may have for this man. I know that people are going to ask about Transformers and G.I. Joe. Tell people about your book.
Oh, yes, I just happen to have it here. A wonderful, life-changing book. I Killed Optimus Prime, So Sue Me. It will change your life. It will end erectile dysfunction. Half the money goes to Israel for me when I was forced to retire there. Anyway, I think you'll like it. It's on Amazon. It always gets 5 stars, and I'm not paying anybody to do that. If you like the Transformers and you like me so far, this shouldn't change your opinion. And while I'm showing you some product available from my supply, I have a wonderful photograph of me and Stan Lee that I will make available for $15 and sign. And last but not least, my fabled Christmas album, Christmas Songs for Jewish People. It'll be a treat.
I have that. It's a great album. Yes.
If anybody still knows what a CD is, they'll love it. Okay, now back to the question.
Okay. Charlie's Angels.
Okay.
The first one, Aaron Spelling Show.
Yeah.
How many of those you write?
I was supposed to write 3, but I only wrote 1, which was a big success. And the reason I only wrote one is because the staff that was producing and writing it, I felt the resentment big time, and I didn't need that. But the one I wrote, Aaron said, "Do you know Sammy Davis?" I said, "Slightly." He said, "Well, Sammy knows you, and he wants you to write a Charlie's Angels episode." So I thought it up. Aaron says, "Come to the house because we want to start to have a table read next Tuesday." So I went to the house, and he said, "What do you have?" I said, "Sammy's double cast. He's Sammy Davis Jr., and he's also a guy that owns a chain of supermarkets or car washes who is a dead ringer who always denies that because he's famous in his own right doing local television spots." He says, "I love it. What happens?" I said, "The kidnappers are looking to ransom Sammy Davis, instead kidnap the schmuck." He said, "Great, let's do that." So I wrote it, and Sammy called. He says, "You nailed it, man. You nailed it. Just in the last scene, make me kinder to the people that screwed me." So I did. Thereafter, Aaron said, "We're going to do a spin-off of Starsky and Hutch. We're going to do it with Antonio Fargas, who plays
Huggy Boy.
Huggy Bear on
Huggy Bear.
Huggy Bear."
Yeah.
And he said, "We're going to team him up with somebody." I said, "Okay, it's a white detective from the South." He said, "That's great." So I'm writing the script, and I had a thought that one of the snitches that Huggy and his new partner have to go to is Blind Bessie. She's somebody that gives the numbers, the winning numbers, to people for $5, which she has a dream about numbers. But she knows all the racketeers, who's doing what to whom. So she was the snitch, and she hates white people. So Huggy says, "I got to bring you in and pretend you're a brother." He says, "So you talk, you better sound like a brother, or Black Bessie's going to give us nothing." So he's giving him lessons in being black. And the first line was, "When do the new Cadillacs come in?" So I ran it past Sammy, and he roared with laughter. He said, "Great, go with it." So I did. It was a 2-hour movie. It did just great. Huggy Bear and the Turkey, because the white cop from the South was Kurt Turquette. He was from Louisiana. Anyway, had great fun on it. It was really well done, a great pilot. A lot of kudos, great rating. But then I heard on the grapevine, whatever that means, ABC said they cannot have a black man as the star of a prime time series. So I get, "Can you rewrite it with a different guy?" And I said, "Why?" They said, "Well, if we get the right white face, it might be more acceptable. We're going to cast the guy who plays the captain on Love Boat." I said,
Gavin McLeod?
"Yep." And I said, "It's a gig." And Aaron says, "You got to do it." So I did it. And it was a substantially new script because this was a different kind of character. But finally, ABC elected not to do it. They had it programmed for the fall, but then they backed off because, as I heard later from one of the executives, you can't put a black guy on as the star of a primetime show on ABC.
Didn't they have What's Happening at the time?
Yes.
Didn't they have Carter Country that season?
It was coming out, but they weren't building a big night at ABC with black shows. But that's what ABC did to get back in the television business when they were a distant number 3 to NBC and CBS. They went for urban shows like That's My Mama, which I did a lot of.
Which was another black show.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But hey, black lives have always mattered to me. And I was always friendly with blacks and they with me before it was fashionable. In fact, I found out what good friends I had among people of color when I ran for the president of my senior class at Taylor Alderdice High School. And I knew I was going to lose because there were high school fraternities who were very powerful. People sucked up to them and they had their candidate. And then I win, and I win big. I was stunned. Then I see one of my black friends who was on the track team. He says, "Congratulations, man." I says, "Yeah, I can't believe I won." He says, "We put you there." I said, who's we? He says, everybody that ain't white. You're the only white guy that talks to us.
Yeah.
Is that sad?
Yeah, I think they're gonna try that again for the presidential election. But anyway, we got a question here about Get Smart. A couple questions about Get Smart.
Right.
Did we like Get Smart a lot? Will you work with Pat on that?
Yeah, Pat and I were partners on it, and we had great fun. And the first show we wrote was called The Day Smart Turned Chicken, which begins with him in a chicken suit.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he's like running into a courtroom or something like that. Yeah, I remember that one.
Okay. Anyway, Helmut Dantine was a fan of Pat's. Helmut Dantine was a very Germanic-looking Jewish actor, handsome, who thought Pat was wonderful. So anytime Pat was visible in any restaurant, Helmut would run over. And he had this very Germanic accent, very good. And he says to Pat, Pat, tell me, what are you working on now? And Pat says, Get Smart. He says, Get Smart. I'm loving that show. What is your episode called? And Pat said, The Day Smart Turned Chicken. And Helmut said, The Day Smart Turned Chicken. Wunderbar. Anyway.
Who did you work with Buck Henry on that show, or who did you deal with?
Story editor. But Buck, I always detected a kind of competitive nastiness. He was nice to Pat, and I never knew why, but I didn't care. You know, okay, I'll do as many of these shows as they want me to do, but I'll avoid them if I can, because I like to work for people who like me and aren't sort of waiting to take me on. Because believe me, I love collaborating. I'm not trying to take over anybody's show. I'm just trying to do my job. And I'm happy when people want me to do my job. So I backed out. I saw Buck Henry over the years, and he was usually indifferent or cold. And when I was with Pat, of course, he was very warm and loving. But I said, in the vernacular of the trade, fuck Buck.
Robert Rose found one on IMDb that you worked on. Dick Van Dyke Meets Bill Cosby.
Yes, absolutely. I loved working with Dick. In fact, I worked on a special with him. I forget which one it was. He loved me, and he bought the rights to a book called How to Become a Bishop Without Being Religious, which was a big hit. And Dick was an ardent churchgoer and a very religious, moral, lovely guy. And he wanted to turn it into a movie. So Pat and I were working together at the time. We met with him. We made a nice deal. And then we started to write the book, only Pat was never there. So I would write enough to meet with Dick. He says, great, where's Pat? And I said, he's with his wife. She was a nurse, lovely woman, forget her name. I'd make excuses. Finally, the script is done, getting done. And Dick says, where the hell is Pat? And I said, I got to level with you. I don't know. And then Pat calls me from New York. He says, I'm working on the Kraft Music Hall. Cover for me.
Pat was everywhere. He was all over the place. Anyway.
Yeah,
okay, now I've got a two-part question here, and I apologize that I don't know much about the Transformers. It's a show I never got into here, but Michael Seabach writes, Ron, the Transformers fandom assumes you name the new characters created for the movie. Some are straightforward, like Hot Rod and Scourge. Then you have Cup, as in pickup truck. Other names still mystify the TF fandom, Transformers fandom. Do you remember the meanings behind Archie, female robot, Monster Planet Unicron, originally Ingester, and Junkion leader Wreck-Gar? Do any of these names ring bells for you?
I know them all, and I created most of them. And as far as meetings, I never had meetings. I had like one meeting at the start with Joe and Tom, Griffin and Bacall, and they had absolute confidence in me after G.I. Joe, and they called me in and had me look at the Transformers, many episodes of which had been filmed in Japan, and many scripts had been written. And they said, the show isn't working. Would you please fix each script? So I rewrote the first 60 episodes, some minimally, very few minimally, but all of them with the idea of making sure the story's tracked and that the character of the characters emerged. Because I've always worked with this idea that the universal story is family. Everybody relates to that. Everybody has an uncle who flashes a school bus. Everybody has the old aunt who still thinks she's 16 and dresses accordingly. And every family has its big daddy who may be Big Mama or Big Aunt Sarah. So everybody relates. So with G.I. Joe, I made sure I created the bad family, which were Cobra, and I created the good family, which was Joe. And I made sure that the father figure in Joe, which varied between Hawk and I forget the other guy right now because it's been forever, and the bad family was the Cobra Commander and Destro, that they had family nuance and that they treated each other with the good family with respect and affection, rooting for each other all the time. They never wavered in that loyalty and family trust. But the bad guys always were trying to get one up on each other, always trying to screw each other, always trying to take the credit, and always doing what they could to eliminate the competition. And though I also decided that these are larger than life characters, if they're not, these little action figures have no clout. They've got to have emotion. Because if you can put emotion in a script, the audience, the readers, they're yours. They want to feel something. And you can't feel something about two-dimensional characters who give you nothing to go on. The unusual voices are nice, but it's what they say that establishes who they are, and you'll love them or hate them or both at the same time. So these are larger than life characters. I made the villains Shakespearean villains.
Okay, but
yeah, go ahead.
But now the gentleman, I think he wanted to know about the names.
Yeah. Unicron was mine. Rick Gar.
Okay, but where'd you get the name? What is it?
I made them up.
But well, I mean,
Rick Gar was the leader on the planet Junkdion. So everything on the planet was made from junk, scavenged from planets all over the universe. And everything they spoke was junk because they had tapped into television on Earth. And so everything they said was part of a commercial or a catch line from a show. So I figured that the boss should be Wreck-Gar because he's dealing in wreckage, picking up the pieces. Unicron, I was looking for a catchy name to indicate this massive force that united everything with his being. An all-devouring creature that fed his ego literally with planets and robots and so on. And RC, I insisted on having a female character because I felt little girls like this stuff too. I know because my daughter was young, she loved it. So I figured there are other little girls, and why not? I thought this will make more fans for Transformers, who otherwise might say the hell with it, that's for boys. I also insisted that characters be killed because I felt a bloodless story, a feature film. Disney proved that you got to recognize that the dark needs the light to be established, and the light needs the dark to sell it. So I didn't have trouble with that. Griffith and Bacall decided, let's get rid of this, let's get rid of this. I said, fine, we'll do that. And then the part I hated, they said, and we want to kill off Optimus Prime. And I said, you can't do that. They said, we're paying for it, we can do it. Hasbro wants to do this. I said, I promise you that if I do this, and I'll do the best job I can doing it, so it's a big emotional moment, I said, I guarantee you you'll have to revive him in less than a year. And they said, never. But why did you say that? I said, because Optimus Prime is Big Daddy for the Autobots. It's like Odin in Norse mythology. He's like Jupiter in Roman mythology. He's like Zeus in Greek mythology. He is Big Daddy. All the characters relate to him as the head of the family. I said, you just don't eliminate him and bring in somebody new and hope that it'll work. So I created Rodimus Prime because I had to go somewhere and had to be a young character. And they handled the death of Optimus Prime right. I called for there to be no color when he dies. They did it right. But for years afterwards, people who recognized me because they saw me with Stan Lee or in a Comic-Con would say this to me. And the first time I did a Comic-Con last year in Burbank, people, 3 generations came to the table where I was flogging my book and other things. And it would be the grandfather or the father or the great-grandfather said this to me. I was 7 years old and I watched the Transformers, the movie, and you killed Optimus Prime. Will you sign my underwear? But I had hit home with generations because the family element was strong. And therefore, the emotional response to the death of Optimus Prime bonded people to the series emotionally. So working with Griffith and Paul, working with Hasbro was great fun. And for G.I. Joe, I did the groundbreaking 5-part miniseries pilot because I said, you have more characters in G.I. Joe than the population of Bangladesh. In a 22-minute pilot, it won't be a story, it'll be a fucking parade. Kids can't connect to a parade. They need enough face time and enough dialogue and enough action to connect to a character and decide if they like him, her, if they want to care to be bothered. They bought that, and that was good because it enabled me to find a way to tell all of these stories at the same time. That's what I did with Transformers, the movie. Anyway, that's all the truth. And I did a lot of other work for Hasbro that never got made. And one of the things I'm sorry didn't get made was called Air Raiders, which was a kind of ripoff of Dune, a series of sci-fi books about warring planets for the purchase finding of oxygen, without which they all died. So oxygen was the energon of this franchise. The characters, the artwork, the design of the toys, of the figures, was sensational. And all of the figures, all of the toys were to be air-powered. And I thought, fabulous. So I wrote the 5-parter, everybody's excited, and then they sent me some of the toy prototypes. So here's one of the characters with a hose and a rubber bulb. You squeeze the bulb, and the character has a seizure. And I thought, every kid will love that. So you squeeze the bulb, and the character does that. And then there were the weapons. So there was this rocket array with the hose and the bulb. And you squeezed it, and they went. So they killed it. I was sorry because I think it would have been great, but not with air.
Michael Seabach, who asked the previous questions, said, I said, I own your Air Raiders scripts.
Congratulations, because I can sell you one at a steep price.
And T.F. Cannon, who we quoted, T.F. Cannon already said, although I always prefer Rodimus Prime as a character, Ron really was right about the death of Optimus.
I thank you for that.
Okay, Ron, here I think we got time for 1 or 2 more questions. Here's a question for you. As you may know, I taught comedy writing down at USC for a while. You've taught writing in a lot of different places.
Yes.
You are probably way better at it than I was. I gave it up. I didn't like doing it. If I'd got another season, I did 2 semesters. If I got another semester, I was going to ask you to come down and speak to my class.
And I would have.
I did. I brought in Chuck McCann one time. I brought in Treva Silverman. I brought in a bunch of very fine writers.
I'm sure it's
okay. So when we do this, we would bring in an episode of one of their shows, a comedy show. If I had brought you in, and I said to you, Ron, what half-hour comedy script that you've done would you like me to show? Pick one. You only get one.
I would say the first Odd Couple I wrote, which was called Scrooge Gets an Oscar. I got a call from Jerry Davis, the producer, around midnight, and he says, we got to have a Christmas show. We've tried 2 of them. They didn't work. Come in tomorrow and tell us what you're going to do. So I came in and I said, we're going to do A Christmas Carol with Scrooge played by Oscar. And it's Oscar's dream of what happens when he refuses to do some benefit show for an orphanage. Gary Marshall says, come back with that. So I did.
Wasn't Jerry a great guy, Jerry Davis?
That's wonderful. Wonderful.
Did you ever see the movie tribute or the play tribute with Jack Lemmon?
Absolutely.
It was based largely on Jerry.
I know, because Byrne Slade was a friend of mine, as he was Jerry's friend. And when Byrne wrote the play and he sent it to Jerry, he says, what do you think? Jerry says, it's my fucking life. What do you think I think? So Byrne was shamed into giving him a piece of the action.
Yes,
it's true.
But I saw Jerry and his son doing that whole routine that's in the play.
Oh yeah.
Such. I'm gonna wrap this up in a minute, but I got to tell my favorite Jerry Davis story.
Please.
And you probably know, and you know the punchline to this. Don't give it away.
I won't.
Jerry married this absolutely stunningly beautiful woman, most beautiful woman you ever saw. She was an actress they hired on Bewitched when he was producing it, and they had a wonderful life together. And Jerry had mended his ways, which prior to her involved sleeping with every woman he could find any place in his life. There was an actress, not a particularly attractive one, who made friends with Jerry and was always coming into his office on The Odd Couple. You know where this is going, right? Okay. And she kept telling Jerry, can't you give me a part on the show? I'm starving. I'm broke. I can't make my rent. Please give me a part on the show. And he just said, I can't do it. She really wasn't qualified for it, and they really didn't need a lot of actresses on that show. Finally, when Penny Marshall left The Odd Couple, because she'd been playing Oscar Madison's secretary, this actress barges into Jerry's office one day and says, you've got to give me the part. I'm going to be the new secretary. And he says, we're writing the character out. We're not replacing Penny Marshall. You can't do it. The actress breaks down crying and saying, please, I need money. I need a job. I need something. So he says, well, listen, I know someone who might need an assistant, like a personal assistant. You want to work for this person? And she says, yes, please, whatever. So Jerry dials his phone. And he says to his friend, I've got this woman here. I'm going to send her over. Maybe you can give her some work doing typing or filing or whatever it is for you. Her name is Erin Fleming, Groucho. And Jerry used to say that was the worst thing he ever did in his life, was connecting her with Groucho. Frightening story. Jerry would probably not be happy that I remember that I tell that story now. But
Groucho, I knew because I did Minnie's Boys rewrite, and it was the story of Groucho Marx, and Groucho was there. And he was an affable guy who talked a lot one day, and the next day he didn't remember me. So he was losing it. But the first time I met him was in a medical building on Camden Drive in Beverly Hills. It was one of these old elevators where you had to tell the elevator operator where you were going. So I'm in the elevator when Groucho comes in and she says, floors, please. He says, you want to take a piss and you can't. What floor is that?
Yeah, he was an amazing person, Groucho. I had lunch about a year ago with Louis J. Stadlin. A bunch of us got together and took lunch
in Minnie's Boys.
Yeah, and he told similar stories about his relationship with Groucho. Very friendly one day, and the next a little cold. But
I got to tell you that I rewrote Minnie's Boys to star Louis Stadlin Jr. I had him open the show, talking as Groucho would about his life, and then going off him for the show. So the director, Stanley Prager, said, this is fucking brilliant. This will work because it keeps Shelley in minimal roles and she doesn't have to carry the show because she can't. Anyway, the producer says, absolutely not. People are going to buy tickets to see Shelley. So I often thought I'd love to have gotten that script to Louis Stadlin because he would have known what I thought of his talent and him.
Well, he probably knew, that he was carrying that show because he was that show has actually had a better life without Shelley Winters. All the productions of it have done better without her in it over the years. Kay Ballard was doing it a lot for a while, and a number of other people. It's still not a fabulous show,
No,
yeah. So, but anyway, Jerry, I'm going to let you go. Ron, I'm going to let you go here. I got Jerry Davis on my head right now here. I'm going to let you go now, Ron. But thank you for doing this with it. You've been a good friend to me for some time. And maybe we'll have you, if I do more of these, we'll have you back and we'll go through another, 30 of your credits and another 30 after that, and so on.
Mark, because you've been a wonderful friend to me forever.
Well, you get along with everybody. It's one of the many things I admire about you. I do not know anyone who ever spoke ill of you. There's probably somebody someplace. Maybe I'll start the trend later on, but
if you dig deep enough, you'll find some.
It's so strange. I've as a recurring topic I mentioned on these broadcasts is everybody I know intersects with everybody else. We all know a lot of the same people and such. Yep. And like one day I walked into the place where I was doing physical training on my knee, and there is Ron doing physical training for an ailment he had in the same place. And the one I went, the place was near my home. I had an excuse for going there. It was on the other side of town for you. So, but there we were again.
Well, it was a great physical therapy place. I wish I could go back because my sciatica is acting up. But what the hell, you can't do everything.
Well, anyway, thank you for spending this time with us. Folks watching this show will repeat ad infinitum on YouTube immediately following this. If you came in at the end, you can watch the beginning in about a minute, right where you're watching this now. And I'm going to do a few more of these in the next few weeks and then shut down for a while we have this election in this country, because I don't think anybody will be interested in any other topic for about a month in America.
Right, you are.
Anyway. Okay, thank you, Ron. Stay right there, Ron, while I sign us off from the internet.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, everybody.
I really enjoyed it.
Good.